Oh dear God, Libya is kind of a mess right now. Yeah, okay, I say right now. It's been a mess for a while, to be fair. Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel, and I'm going to ask you all a question. What happens when a country's leader goes against the status quo so hard that the world's greatest powers have to come together to oppose him before he sweeps his influence across the entire continent? With or without their consent, but that's kind of besides the point, I guess. And, at the same time, what is the ultimate example of American interference effectively breaking a country's government? Well, the answers to those questions can both be found in the same place: Libya. Come with me, my friends, to the shores of Tripoli, as today we're going to be reviewing the life and legacy of Muammar Gaddafi, the tyrant, and what happened to the country he led after the US moved its pieces there in the real-world version of the game Risk. And hey, along the way, you might actually just learn something about global currency and reserve systems too, because all that is tied in here together. To start though, we are going to need to travel back in time to get some of that most valuable of resource context. Now, for anyone who has been watching the channel for a while, we mentioned Gaddafi briefly in our video about the Toyota War of the 1980s, and if you haven't seen that video, you definitely should go and check that out. It is one of the funnest and wildest videos we've ever made here on this channel. But we are going to be going into depth on the man who led Libya for decades, starting with how he came to power, who started that conflict in the first place. And oh boy, is this guy an absolute character, genuinely one of the weirdest dictators in all of history. Well, my friends, before we go any further, I'd actually like to talk about something with AI that I find rather interesting. For anyone out there who is a student or something along those lines, who may have used ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or any of those things, have you ever found that when you try to actually use an AI like that in order to be able to do something, research something, get an image of something, that something with the AI seems to stop you or censor you? Admittedly, for the past several years, AI has been a little bit weird at times. Well, my friends, the reason that I bring that up in the first place is because I've actually been sponsored by Venice AI, a generative AI that is actually private and permissionless. Considering how many times that my research has the tendency to veer into, well, war crime territory, something like Venice AI is incredibly useful. It doesn't spy on me, it doesn't censor the AI when I'm trying to figure something out, it is super simple with no downloads and there's no installation of any kind. You can simply access it from your web browser. Basically, what I'm trying to say is go ahead and test this out, and by all means, go and click my link down in the description and check out the pro plan for Venice AI, because the amount of features this thing has is incredibly useful for anyone that is trying to do some work or research. Whether that is uploading PDFs in order to get summaries or insights on it, whether that is being able to turn off safe mode for unhindered image generation, or in general, just having limitless text and high image options, it is truly something that is insane. You can use my link down in the description to go sign up, and I'm actually going to have a link for it right here that you can probably see on the screen. And besides that, my friends, thank you all for watching, and enjoy the episode. Born sometime in 1942 to Bedouin nomads, young Muammar was the only son and sent to the nearest town for education. A smart child, he blew through 6 grades in less than 4 years, which was pretty impressive, and the juvenile Gaddafi would sleep in a mosque every night and only saw his family on weekends and holidays, where he'd have to walk 20 miles to go see them. Many of the teachers he had during his schooling were Egyptian, and they taught him about what was happening in the wider Arab world. Gaddafi grew up with heroes like Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the man who served as leader of Egypt from 1954 until his death in 1970. Nasser was an Arab nationalist who promoted socialism, and his book, Philosophy of the Revolution, was a core influence on Gaddafi, especially the portion on how to successfully stage a coup. Fun times. In the year 1959, oil was discovered in Libya. A lot of oil. In fact, Libya was found to have so much oil that it immediately became the country with the largest oil reserves in all of Africa, but more on that later. The boy Gaddafi grew up to be a young man, and from there he would join the Libyan military and began training at the Royal Military Academy. King Idris, the pro-Western monarch in charge of Libya at the time, had allowed British military instructors to help train his soldiers. Gaddafi hated this, and he bristled anytime the British instructors tried to correct him, saying, and I quote, "Who were these imperialists to tell Libyans what to do?" End quote. Which I don't know. I mean, I guess they were there to actually teach how to properly fight. He refused to learn English, was rude to the British constantly, and consequently failed his exams. The British instructors knew he was a problem and reported their issues with Gaddafi to the military academy's commander, who probably promised to do something about it, but then he ended up getting assassinated. And yeah, while they couldn't prove it, the British were pretty sure that Gaddafi had something to do with it, but not enough evidence to actually charge him with anything. It should be mentioned that, hilariously enough, no one ever got in the way of Gaddafi's military training again. He easily progressed through the rest of his training and graduated in 1965 as a communications officer for the Libyan Signal Corps. Now that he'd accomplished the first step in his plan, Gaddafi moved on to the second. He gained the trust of a group of young officers. Now, why young officers, you may wonder? Well, if he had chosen older officers, there stood a much greater chance that their loyalties remained more with the king, and the whole plot that he was trying to cook up being exposed could really happen. They called themselves the Central Committee of the Free Officers Movement. They met in secret and were organized into cells, so that if one cell got discovered, the rest of the plan could stay in motion. They even pooled their salaries together into a single fund for the organization. Together, they planned and waited for their moment to strike. And that moment would arrive on September 1st, 1969, this being when King Idris traveled to Turkey for an operation and vacation. And that is when Gaddafi's group would execute what they called Operation Jerusalem, which what's funny is that while they already would have chosen this moment for their revolution, another group of officers led by an influential pair of brothers who were also officers were attempting to get their plans for revolution accomplished at the same time. Gaddafi just benefited from better long-term planning and execution on the day that was required. His officers and soldiers loyal to him occupied airports, police stations, radio stations, and every government office they could find. Facing little to no resistance, they essentially achieved a bloodless coup. So it was then, my friends, that the Revolutionary Command Council was placed in charge of the new Libyan Arab Republic, as the country would be known until 1977. Now, Gaddafi was only a lieutenant when he led the revolution, so one of his first acts was to promote himself to colonel and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Go figure. The reality was that Gaddafi dominated the council by sheer force of will and personality. The capital was moved to Tripoli. They banned political parties, trade unions, worker strikes, and even suspended the publication of newspapers at one point. During these early years, Gaddafi was frustrated by how slow reform was taking place, and he actually resigned his position twice just to come back a month later each time and pick up control of the country like nothing happened. This was something he just did. A little bit of a diva, as you're going to come to understand. Gaddafi claimed that the current oil trade deals that Western and European countries had with Libya were unfair and tilted to favor the buyer. He was telling the truth about this, actually, as it turns out. Gaddafi threatened to decrease production, and he increased the price of oil. This example is one of the primary reasons why the rest of OPEC nations would also increase prices in 1970, leading to the global increase in oil prices that set off gas shortages in the 1970s. With these reworked deals, Gaddafi was even smart enough to include back payment for the previous decade, and this brought his regime in more than $1 billion in less than a year, which, for a country the size of Libya, is genuinely impressive. Now, there's a lot of things that you can call Muammar Gaddafi, but stupid is not one of them. He then moved on to reduce the influence of the oil companies operating in his country and nationalized the entire oil industry, requiring the government to hold a 51% stake in all oil drilling operations conducted in Libya. He and the Revolutionary Command Council implemented a vast array of social reforms, implementing a healthy portion of Sharia law into the mix. They banned alcohol, nightclubs, Christian churches, and changed all signs to read Arabic. But they also made some changes that actually did improve the average person's quality of life. They doubled the minimum wage, put in place price controls, and reduced rent by between 30 to 40%. Interestingly enough, despite putting elements of Sharia law into place, Gaddafi would also introduce multiple laws to protect women's rights. In 1970, he introduced a law decreeing the equality of the sexes and insisted on equal pay for women. In 1972, he passed a law criminalizing marriages of girls under the age of 16, ensuring that women's consent was required for the marriage to be carried out. Now, sadly, this was incredibly progressive for the Arab world, but you gotta remember, this is back in the days when Iran was even letting women have something close to equal rights. Gaddafi would also then increase the amount of jobs available to women in general, and from there, the country kind of got to work. In the early period of 1969 to 1973, one could look at Gaddafi and his government and say that they really were doing their best to improve the quality of the average Libyan person's life. They were making changes happen for the first time all over the country, and oil money paid for all of it. The biggest needs of Libya's growing population at this time were housing, healthcare, and education. Many housing projects were put into development, and by 1978, Libya would have 50% more hospitals as it did just a decade prior. Malaria was essentially eradicated, tuberculosis almost eliminated, and mandatory education was expanded from 6 years to 9 years, and adult literacy programs and free university education were also introduced. To fuel this, the government would build multiple more universities as well. Now, if it seems at this point that I'm listing off a bunch of positive things, I kind of am. You also got to remember I did mention the whole thing about the Sharia law and other weird things that were done, but there were some positive things. He also happened to get up to some dictator stuff this time, too, which involved the expelling of 12,000 Italians that still lived in Libya from its pre-World War II colonial rule, as well as the small community of Libyan Jews. And oh, just wait, a lot more is going to happen besides that. In 1973, Gaddafi began to implement what he called the, quote, popular revolution. This was his way of changing the structure of the Libyan government, and it involved forming the Basic People's Congress, which are kinda like local councils or communes. This was all part of Gaddafi's plan to do away with the Revolutionary Council that had existed previously and bring in his ideal form of government, outlawed in his personal manifesto called the Green Book. So just like Mao had his little red book, we have Gaddafi's Green Book. By 1977, the transition was complete. The Libyan Arab Republic had now become the Great Socialist People Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. Jamahiriya. Wow, that is a name. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. Yeah, to all the Arabs who are in my comment section or watching this video, I do apologize right now. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, even though again I'm butchering it, Jamahiriya is just a big fancy Arabic word that means state of the masses. And it is meant to emphasize the direct democracy of the country. It can be loosely translated as meaning something like People's Republic in English, and that is what Gaddafi wanted. Anyway, not necessarily everything that he was doing at this time was just for the people. This is where you start to see moments where Gaddafi is growing more and more eccentric. He starts wearing designer sunglasses everywhere, luxurious traditional Libyan robes, and weirdly enough, no matter where it is that he travels, he always has a massive Bedouin-style tent set up with a bonfire so that he can rest and sleep in the same manner as he preferred, no matter where it is that he was. We're going to get more onto that here later. Going back to the organizational structures, people's committees were established in very widely divergent organizations: universities, private business firms, government bureaucracies, and broadcast media. Geographically based committees were formed at the government, municipal, and zone, that being the lowest levels, and seats on the people's committees at the zone level were filled by direct popular election. Members, so elected, could then be selected for service at higher levels. By mid-1973, estimates of the number of people's committees ranged above 2,000. In the scope of their administrative and regulatory tasks and the method of their member selection, the People's Committee purportedly embodied the concept of direct democracy that Gaddafi propounded in the first volume of the Green Book, which appeared in 1976. The same concept lay behind proposals to create a new political structure composed of People's Congresses. The centerpiece of the new system was the General People's Congress, the GPC, a national representative body intended to replace the RCC. And Gaddafi was ready to take his place, can you guess where? At the top of this new pyramid, as the brotherly leader and guide of the revolution, as his new title described him. In reality, he still held complete control over the military, and therefore the rest of the government. But the People's Congress proved really popular and got a lot of people involved in their local government regarding things that affected their everyday lives, which was kind of cool too. Of course, knowing how Gaddafi was and what he was becoming, you can be sure there was another motive for this new reorganization, that it turns out, within a few years, 10 to 20% of all Libyans were being paid to conduct surveillance on others within their Basic People's Congress. Oh yeah, Gaddafi had just created another way to keep tabs on people in his country, and now it was time for Gaddafi to implement the plan contained within Volume 2 of the Green Book. This said private retail, trade, rent, and wages were forms of exploitation that should be abolished. Instead, workers' self-management committees and profit participation partnerships were to function in public and private enterprises. To explain this and give an example, a property law was passed that forbade ownership of more than one private dwelling, and Libyan workers took control of a large number of companies, turning them into state-run enterprises. Retail and wholesale trading operations were replaced by state-owned people's supermarkets, where Libyans in theory could purchase whatever they needed at low prices. By 1981, the state had also restricted access to individual bank accounts to draw upon privately held funds for government projects. The measures created resentment and opposition among the newly dispossessed. The latter would end up joining those already alienated, some of whom had begun to leave the country. By 1982, perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 Libyans had fled abroad. Because many of the immigrants were among the enterprising and better educated Libyans, the wealthier ones that typically had the know-how and will to operate businesses, they represented a very significant loss of managerial and technical expertise. Gaddafi had unintentionally caused a brain drain to begin leaving Libya. Of course, it didn't matter to him. He was on to the next step of his plan, making the world listen. You see, since early 1972, obtaining nuclear weapons had been an idea of Gaddafi's, which is always fantastic for a dictator to try and do. First, he tried to buy a nuke from China. They said no, so he moved on and asked Pakistan for one, and this was unsuccessful too. Later on, he would move to asking India, and they agreed to help him build nuclear energy plants. But when their prime minister visited, all Gaddafi wanted to do was talk about buying nukes from them, and when the prime minister refused, Gaddafi called him, quote, a corrupt politician, which offended him and caused him to break off all talks and immediately return home. The man was a brilliant negotiator, you know? Throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Gaddafi would continue to try and obtain nuclear weapons with no success. There is a scene at the beginning of the 1985 movie Back to the Future where Doc Brown told Marty to run because the Libyans were coming after he sold them fake plutonium. Yeah, this scene was included because the joke at the time was that the Libyans would do anything to get their hands on nukes. So I guess what I'm saying is that in some weird way, Back to the Future was actually historically accurate there.
Who do you think? The Libyans!
So, as time went on, weird reports started to come out. Thailand reported citizens had helped build storage facilities for nerve gas. Germany would sentence a businessman, Jürgen Hippelstil Imostin, to 5 years in prison for involvement in Libyan chemical weapons. Inspectors from the Chemical Weapons Convention, the CWC, verified in 2004 that Libya owned a stockpile of 23 metric tons of mustard gas and more than 1,300 metric tons of precursor chemicals. So, even if he couldn't get nukes, Gaddafi did have a backup plan, I guess. And guess what? Things were about to get violent. In 1986 and 1987, the government of Chad accused Libya of using toxic gas and napalm against central government forces and against rebel forces. I mean, he had the chemical weapons, so it wouldn't be too out of the question for him to use them in the first place. But yeah, that happened. And then, with time, due to his hatred of the West and what he considered its imperialism, Gaddafi had begun pouring money into various extremist militias and movements throughout the world. He poured millions of dollars into the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. In April of 1986, Libyans acting on Gaddafi's order would carry out the bombing of the La Belle nightclub in West Berlin, a favorite hotspot for American soldiers. That attack would ultimately kill 3 and injure 229 people. The United States would respond with airstrikes on Libya, hitting airfields in Tripoli and Benghazi. Gaddafi would claim that one of those strikes had killed his adopted daughter, but it's hard to find any evidence to actually prove this claim. Gaddafi would also fund the Irish Republican Army. In 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 was blown up over Lockerbie in Scotland, killing 243 passengers and 16 crew members, plus 11 people on the ground. British police investigations identified 2 Libyans responsible for the attack, acting under orders from Gaddafi. When Libya refused to extradite the man responsible, sanctions were placed on them, and it cost them nearly $1 billion. Gaddafi would also support various terrorist and extremist groups in the Philippines, funded FARC in Colombia, and even supported the Orthodox Serbs, led by Slobodan Milosevic, truly one of the world's most evil men in the former Yugoslavia. On top of all this, he had a long history of supporting Hamas as well. He even tried to fund Maori militia groups in New Zealand to cause trouble for America's allies of Australia and New Zealand. The dude basically went wild and started doing everything all at once to piss off every single person on Earth, it seems. Even his own backyard. Libyan involvement occurred in several internal African disputes, such as in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Somalia, Central African Republic, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. Libya also sought to expand its influence in Africa through financial assistance, ranging from aid donations to impoverished neighbors such as Niger to oil subsidies in Zimbabwe. But here, my friends, things start to get really weird. As the 1990s roll in, the Soviet Union collapses, and Gaddafi sees the winds of power and influence changing. At the beginning of the decade, he was still heavily funding terrorism of all kinds. By the time the decade was over, he would basically abandon all of these efforts, attempting to somewhat stay in the good graces of the West. Gaddafi would even go and propose a borderless United States of Africa to transform the continent into a single nation ruled by a single government. The closest the continent would see to this dream would be the African Union, which is still only a portion of Gaddafi's complete vision. But we're going to have to get into that later. Heading into the 2000s, Gaddafi became one of the founders of the African Union, the AU, initiated in July of 2002. In 2009, he would be elected chairman of the AU, which was one of the accomplishments that he cherished the most in his entire life. He also saw what could happen if he didn't check himself when Saddam Hussein was removed from power by the United States and a coalition of allies. So, Gaddafi decided to clean up his image some. He decided to abandon his weapons of mass destruction programs and pay almost 3 billion euros in compensation to the families of Pan Am Flight 103 and UTA Flight 772. The United States responded by taking him off of the state's sponsoring terrorism list. In October of 2007, Libya was even elected to serve for 2 years on the United Nations Security Council. Progress. But then everything kind of hits the fan. In January of 2011, the Arab Spring hit North Africa and the greater Arab world like a sledgehammer for freedom, leading to successful revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, both neighbors of Libya. This put Gaddafi on high alert. Fearing domestic protest, Libya's government implemented preventative measures by reducing food prices, purging the army leadership of potential defectors, and releasing several Islamist prisoners. This didn't really work. And on the 17th of February 2011, major protests broke out against Gaddafi's government. Unlike Tunisia or Egypt, though, Libya was largely religiously homogenous and had no strong Islamist movement. But there was widespread dissatisfaction with the sheer amount of corruption within the government and entrenched systems of patronage, while unemployment, by this time, had reached around 30%. Early on into the conflict, it really did appear that Gaddafi's forces would be able to hold on and maintain control of the country. Rebel militias were trying to organize, but as soon as Gaddafi got word of their location, he would send in his air force to demolish them from the sky. This superior firepower put the rebel groups at a serious disadvantage. And that is when the NATO powers decided to act. Declaring a no-fly zone, the US would go and attack from the sea using the USS Enterprise of all things. And no, I'm not talking about that Enterprise, the aircraft carrier. Yeah, they sent an aircraft carrier, and the French also sent their Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier as well. And from there, they quickly got to work dismantling Gaddafi's military bases, fighter jets, bombers, munitions depots, outposts, and probably a few post offices. And when I say then that NATO ran a bombing campaign, I mean they bombed Libya every day for 7 months. During the 7-month NATO air campaign in Libya in 2011, a total of over 9,700 strike sorties were conducted. These strikes resulted in the destruction of over 5,900 military targets. Additionally, over 7,642 of those strikes used air-to-surface weapons. This included the cooperation of over 19 different countries. They imposed a naval blockade of Libya's ports, effectively shutting off any relief aid that Gaddafi might have been able to get from his allies. And despite possessing numerous anti-aircraft missile systems, Libyan forces were unable to shoot down a single NATO aircraft for the entire campaign. As for how others reacted, the countries that compose both the Arab League and the African Union either stayed silent or they actually joined the side of NATO regarding the Libyan issue at this time. And you would think, okay, hold on, since Libya and Gaddafi had been esteemed members of both of these organizations, perhaps some of these allies would come to his aid at the time. No, they understood what was happening here. Gaddafi was being made an example of. An example of what, you may wonder? Well, the answer to that is going to vary depending upon who you are, what kind of information you have, your political beliefs, and more. There are multiple theories specifically about this. Was Gaddafi a homicidal maniac dictator who'd use chemical weapons on people? Yeah, he likely was. Was Libya a state sponsor of terrorism that would harass entities all over the world? Yes, it was. But also, at the same time, there are additional theories, specifically talking about how Gaddafi was going to disrupt things within the global status quo. You see, in the year 2009, Gaddafi, then president of the African Union, suggested to member states of the African continent to switch to a new currency, independent of the American dollar, the gold dinar. The objective of this new currency was to divert oil revenues towards state-controlled funds rather than American banks. In other words, to stop using the dollar for oil transactions. Countries such as Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Angola were ready to change their currencies. With an excellent management of oil revenues, the Libyan state had managed to store hundreds of tons of gold, 143 tons according to WikiLeaks, and the same amount in silver. All of these resources were going to make Libya one of the most influential countries in all of Africa. Now, how do we know that this is the case? Well, for that, we should actually thank Hillary Clinton and her lack of security regarding emails. You see, besides the horrible cruelty that Gaddafi was enacting upon his own people and the sponsoring of terrorism around the world, at the same time, he was also seen as a threat who could disrupt potential oil as well as trade deals. Gaddafi's plan to implement the Pan-African currency, that was set to be implemented in 2022 if everything went according to plans, which it probably would end up getting delayed if that did happen in the first place, but it is still something that is fascinating to think about. The United States wants people to trade oil for US dollars. It is one of the key ways that it is able to maintain influence, not any other currency. This kind of Pan-African thinking on Gaddafi's part, combined with a plan and potential to actually accomplish, that is something that potentially presents a bit of a threat. And so again, you in the comment section, think what it is that you will. There are multiple ways to interpret this, and the reality of geopolitics is that it's extremely messy. So it was then, in June of 2011, the situation was getting critical for Gaddafi. Amnesty International would publish their report, finding that Gaddafi's forces were responsible for numerous war crimes, but added that a number of allegations of human rights abuses lacked credible evidence. The report added that, quote, much Western media coverage has, from the outset, presented a very one-sided view of this logic of events, portraying the protest movement as entirely peaceful and repeatedly suggesting that the regime's security forces were unaccountably massacring unarmed demonstrators, end quote. This is one of those things when it comes to social media and media in general, is that things are usually far more gray than you really hear about with stories. As it was, though, because of the campaign against their own people, Libya was losing the public relations campaign, and over 30 countries would end up recognizing the Benghazi-based National Transitional Council as the legitimate government of Libya. In August, the rebels would seize Tripoli. Gaddafi retreated back to his hometown of Sirte, which was still a Gaddafi forces stronghold. There, he changed houses every other day and laid low, making radio addresses claiming to still be in power. But he knew his time was almost up. He could feel the metaphorical noose tightening around his neck. So it was, on October 20th, Gaddafi would record a farewell message for his family and set out with his security team determined to make it through the encircling forces around the town to reach the Direct Valley. Gaddafi wished to die close to where he was born. They drove through the rebel forces and then got surrounded near a construction site where they exited the vehicle and hid in giant drainage pipes while Gaddafi's men tried to fight off the rebels. Someone threw a grenade. Shrapnel struck Gaddafi in the head, injuring him. His defense minister, who had been standing right next to him, would be killed. The militia members would take Gaddafi hostage. They beat him, and some people say that he was shot in the stomach. But what no one can deny, because it happened to be caught on video, was what happened next. With the grainiest of 2011-era mobile phone video quality, some militia members decided to record the events just as Gaddafi was being beaten and apprehended. And as for what happened next, look, there's no good real way to say this, so I'm just going to say it. Just after they started recording, someone grabbed either a knife or a bayonet and proceeded to jam it up a place that a knife is most certainly not going to belong. In the US Army, there was actually a prank at one point in the 2010s where you go behind someone and then stick a knife hand between cheeks and then wiggle it side to side. It got the nickname of getting Gaddafi'd for that very reason. Anyway, after this, Gaddafi was loaded into an ambulance and taken to the hospital where he was promptly pronounced dead. The Mad Dog of the Middle East, as Reagan had dubbed him, had been put down. After Gaddafi's death, the National Transitional Council would announce that they were going to hold elections within 18 months. Unfortunately, in the power vacuum left by Gaddafi's fall, numerous militia groups would take what they could as payback for what Gaddafi had taken from them. In an attempt to calm the rebels, the interim government would offer to pay the militias as an extension of the army. Due to this, even Islamic extremists gained access to funds from the government of Libya, totaling up to $1.4 billion. The country began to become overrun by rebel militias. And what they needed now was a leader and a hero, someone who could take charge. And that is when Khalifa Haftar would return once again to Libya, which allow me to explain that. Way back in 1987, Colonel Khalifa Haftar was one of Muammar Gaddafi's most trusted men. He was placed in charge of a special mission inside of Chadian territory during the Libya-Chad War, and was captured along with around 700 or so of his men. Because they weren't supposed to be in Chad at the time, Gaddafi disavowed all connection to them and essentially threw them all under the bus to the international community. That is where the CIA stepped in and approached Haftar. For the next decade, he would help them form anti-Gaddafi militia groups in and around Libya, until, after an attempted coup on Gaddafi failed in 1996, Haftar and 300 of his men were granted refugee status in the United States. Haftar would settle in Falls Church, Virginia, just a few miles down the road from where the CIA's headquarters is in Langley. Within months of returning to Libya in 2011, he was made the overall commander of the new Libyan army. In 2012, the Government of National Unity, or GNC, would take power and immediately faced several serious challenges. One of them occurred in Benghazi in September of 2012 when Islamic militant extremists attacked the U.S. consulate and killed the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens, and 3 other Americans in his entourage. And this event can be attributed to the way that the United States handled its involvement in Libya. The U.S., still traumatized by the debacle in Iraq and worsening conflict in Afghanistan, famously chose to lead from behind on Libya. French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who had spearheaded the NATO intervention, and UK Prime Minister David Cameron were quickly distracted by political problems at home. In other words, the NATO allies took out the government in Libya and then kind of just left. They didn't stick around to make sure that the government was stable, like in Iraq, or that it even qualified as a new government at the time, like in the case of Afghanistan. No, the US government kind of forgot that if you go and topple a dictator from the skies and the oceans, you can't just rule a country from the sky alone. This is why so many militia groups plagued the country. There were no framework created for the people to start over again. And this power vacuum was so bad that by 2012, even ISIS had joined the fray. They took over numerous towns across Libya, including Sirte, Gaddafi's own hometown. Barack Obama, US president at the time, was even quoted in an interview as saying that the way his administration handled the Libyan situation was the greatest regret of his entire presidency. As for Libya itself, those excluded from power under the current regime, such as the ex-Gaddafi loyalists, they demanded more of a share of resources. Those who were perceived to have benefited previously complained that they were unjustly cut out, even though they had taken part in the revolution. Mistrust and resentment swelled, and there was little in the way of government institutions or civil society to manage disagreements. Eventually, the militias got their people into parliament and took over that too, kicking everyone else out. Those who were pushed out of the government traveled to the east to Benghazi and regrouped under the leadership of General Khalifa Haftar, who'd had enough of the chaos and bloodshed. If the first Libyan civil war was what happened in the 8 months after Gaddafi's death, then the second Libyan civil war would be what occurred between 2014 and 2020. The General National Congress, based out of Tripoli in the west, fought against the House of Representatives that operates out of central and eastern Libya and had the loyalty of the Libyan National Army led by General Haftar. The ports of Libya's state-run oil company, the National Oil Corporation, were taken by Haftar during this time, and he increased their output from 220,000 barrels a day to over 600,000 barrels a day. Over time, he got those numbers up past 1 million. Eventually, he was able to push ISIS out of the parts of Libya that his forces controlled. But that doesn't mean that things are that much better. The World Food Program reported that an estimated 435,000 people had been forcibly displaced from their homes during the conflict. And when I tell you that we could probably do a 3-hour-long video on the second Libyan civil war, I am not understating things. The amount of players involved, the battles won, people assassinated, governments dissolved, etc. It's just so stupid of a wild time for the country. As it was, the second Libyan civil war ended with the ceasefire on the 23rd of October 2020. The Government of National Unity was formed on the 10th of March 2021 with Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh as Prime Minister. The House of Representatives, based in eastern Libya, passed a motion of no confidence against the unity government on the 21st of September 2021, and on the 10th of February 2022, appointed Fathi Bagasha as Prime Minister, an appointment rejected by Dbeibeh and the GNU. Dbeibeh received 39 out of 73 votes in the 2021 Libya Political Dialogue Forum, yet he remains Prime Minister for 4 years and counting. He was supposed to leave the temporary position in 2022. Now, the Eastern government in Benghazi calls itself the Government of National Stability, but really nothing has changed. For the last couple of years, the West is controlled by Dbeibeh and the former GNU, while the central and eastern portion of the country remains under the control of the Tripoli-based GNS, led by General Haftar. So it is then, my friends, in 2025, this year, the Libyan National Army, LNA, led by General Khalifa Haftar, is being supported by Russia, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and France. In contrast, Turkey, Qatar, and Italy have all backed the Government of National Accord, the GNA, led by Prime Minister Fayez el-Sarraj. Haftar lets Russia exploit Libyan territory, knowing the Kremlin will ignore the manner in which he rules. As Haftar's son, Saddam, recently appointed as Chief of Staff of the Libyan Armed Forces, consolidates more power, he too will rely on a partnership with Russia for the same reasons. Despite this, the Biden administration sought to pull Haftar and his two sons away from the influence of the Russians by sending an envoy no less than 7 times to meet with them. And the Trump administration appears to be doing the same. Both Saddam Haftar and his father, Belgasim, who runs the Eastern-based Libya Development and Reconstruction Fund, visited Washington the week of April 27, 2025. But again, that is not stopping things from being as messy as they are. In February, 2 mass graves were discovered in Jakarta and Al-Kufra, with 10 and 93 bodies respectively in them. Many of these bodies were migrants who are uniquely vulnerable to human trafficking, forced disappearance, and killings. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, recorded over 1,000 migrant deaths and disappearances in Libya in 2024 alone. In May of 2025, over 80 bodies were discovered at various mass burial sites in and around Tripoli. The GNU supported and state-backed security forces, the Stabilization Support Apparatus, are an armed group suspected of having killed these people. It would appear that the Western governments have some explaining to do. These killings caused massive protest in Tripoli, as the people who live there are pretty fed up with the government. Most of them were calling for Prime Minister Dbeibeh's resignation. Other ministers in various parts of the government resigned, but Dbeibeh refused to. And so, if you asked us here on the channel as to what our bet would be about the future, what is going to happen with Dbeibeh, we would probably guess that he is going to be removed from power, either by someone within the GNU or Haftar's forces within the next year. We're going to see if that prediction holds true, but looking at the situation as it occurs now, General Haftar just seems to have the momentum and all the best pieces on the board, while the GNU continues to be mediocre and disappointing to people. So, this all leads to the summary of our story. Should Western nations get involved in overthrowing other countries' governments if they don't have a plan to help those countries stay stable in the aftermath? Well, I don't really know. Will the people of Libya continue to struggle until a clear and single government rules the land? Oh, absolutely, yes. But hey, remember when I mentioned that Gaddafi was unique and that he wanted to start a pan-African currency that would undermine the US dollar? Well, it just so turns out that another modern-day African leader is attempting to follow in Gaddafi's footsteps and actually is making significantly more progress than Gaddafi ever did. So, we are going to be covering that actually in an upcoming video. Who is this leader, you may wonder? Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré. Yeah, I'm sorry, for those of you who've been watching this entire video was pretty much a primer to discuss the current leader of a different African country for a future video. But it's one of those things that was kind of important for context that I didn't want to make that video like 3 hours long while trying to then explain what is going on here. But, anyways, for all of you who've been watching, thank you for doing so. Please make sure to like, to comment, to subscribe if you haven't. Support us on Patreon if you can, as this type of topic is definitely something that really gets heard on YouTube. I've had a couple videos in the last few weeks that have been demonetized, which has really been affecting me. So, with that, my friends, I appreciate you all, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, my friends.